There are currently 83 brawlers in Brawl Stars, so it can be hard to just choose one brawler to upgrade for the long term. Because of that, I compiled all of KairosTime's tier list from the past 3 years onto these graphs, then averaged each brawler's performance to find out their average tier and put them on our tier list, going from the worst brawlers to the best brawlers to upgrade for the long term. And coming in at dead last is Doug. Since his release, Doug has always been a really flawed character, being a support tank brawler with a short range circular attack, mediocre gadgets, and no special movement or supercharge abilities. All this contributes to him only having been in F tier in all tier lists except at the start where he was new, and in this period where he had a glitch which allowed him to heal double the normal amount. Averaging the tiers he was ranked over the past 3 years, with F tier being worth 0 points and S tier being worth 5, he gets 0.57 points, which means he's been on average D tier over the past 3 years. Edgar is next up with a short range and high mobility, making him a very polarizing character. This of course also makes him extremely difficult to balance, with Edgar only having been above B tier for short amounts of time before either getting power equipped or nerfed. All this means that his average tier over the past 3 years has been D tier, placing him just a bit above Doug. The Milkman Hank himself is next. His main attack is really unique, probably the most unique in the game, so it's really hard for him not to be either really good or really bad. And Hank was really good when he was released, but then he was nerfed to the ground, so his average tier is also D, next to Doug and Edgar. Now Jackie is similar to Doug, but trades support capabilities for aggro capabilities, allowing her to be a more effective tank with her extra damage and mobility. Because of this, she's been on average D tier over the past 3 years, although her recent trends show that she may be becoming a more solid brawler with her hypercharge and the meta catering more towards tanks. Frank hasn't received a lot of balance changes over the past 3 years, but his tier has still trended down because players just got smarter and learned how to play against him. That being said though, his rework around 3 months ago made him soar to S tier, although the recent nerfs to his star power, health, and gadget might tone him down a bit. This all contributes to Frank's average tier being a very high D tier. It really seems like all the tanks are here because Bull is next. Bull really depends on getting close to enemies and dealing massive damage to them, and if he can't do that, he's basically useless. So he's been below B tier for most of the past 2 years, and even though he was A tier for one meta after he got his hypercharge, he seems to be falling off into irrelevancy again as more and more brawlers also get their hypercharges. And averaging the tiers he has ranked over the past 3 years reveals that he's our first on average C tier brawler. El Primo's tier has fluctuated a lot throughout the past 3 years, and if you like the brawlers to max out to be consistently good, El Primo's probably not the one to pick. And although he's been in the B and A tiers a couple of times, he's usually below average, so his average tier is C. And the 75th best brawler to upgrade is Shelly. Shelly's really interesting because she was F tier for such a long time before she was buffed and got her hypercharge. Although she was buffed a couple of months ago, she's falling off again as better tank counters like Chester, Meg, and Colette take her place, meaning that her average tier is also C tier. Mortis is next, and he seems to have small spikes of being good after a buff, then trickles down to the bottom of the meta due to either power creep or the meta around him just changing to be more tankier. This graph shows him slowly dropping down the meta, but this trend might change because he just got a really good hypercharge in this update. Averaging his tiers over the past 3 years, it's C. At number 73 is Colt, who was pretty bad in the past, but recently redeemed himself with a reload speed buff. Taking into account the past 3 years of his performance though, his average tier is C. Dynamite is the first thrower we're seeing, and he was pretty bad 3 years ago, being F tier for nearly an entire year. But with unbreakable walls being reintroduced into the game and being given a hypercharge, he shot up to the A and B tiers. Averaging all the tiers over the past 3 years yields a C, but I'd say he's a really solid brawler to upgrade for now. Penny has been at the top of the meta in the past due to her turret being buffed with a pet gear in conjunction with the Wally map pool, but after being meta for a couple of months, Supercell nerfed her a ton, which caused her to quickly leave the S tier and enter the F tier. She is C tier over the past 3 years though. Mr. P has had a very interesting past in terms of the meta, sometimes being really solid at A tier and sometimes being not so good at F tier. This all has to do with his playstyle being centered around heavy control and spawning porters, but having no way to deal burst damage to counter aggressive brawlers. Fun fact, Mr. P didn't get any nerfs between this point and this point. In fact, he got buffs. It was just a faster paced meta that slowly pushed him down the tiers, placing him in C tier on average. BB's been a mediocre tank over the past 3 years and slowly slipped down the ranks until she got her hypercharge, where she shot up to A tier, but she seems to be slipping down the meta again, giving her an average of C tier. Chester had an explosive start at his release, starting his journey off at S tier, but was quickly nerfed, causing him to slowly move down all the way to D tier. Recently though, he made it all the way back to A tier because of his star power rework, giving him an average tier of high C. Bo is next, with him having been everything from F tier to S tier over the past 3 years due to a multitude of reasons ranging from his gadgets to his damage. This all makes him the first one in B tier and the 67th best brawler to upgrade. Daryl was really good for one meta in the past 3 years, and that was when he had a 90% damage reduction shield when supering. As soon as that was nerfed though, he started dropping down the ranks, and in the last meta, he was an F tier brawler. He did get a buff that allows him to use his super 2 times every time he charges his super though, so I predict that he's gonna be pretty solid in this meta. Averaging the past, he's at the bottom of B tier for this tier list. Gale is a hard counter to tanks, and naturally becomes meta when tanks are meta, and becomes obsolete when tanks aren't as good. Right now, tanks are pretty good, so Gale's also pretty good, with him being able to do a ton of damage with his super even after the nerf or bug fix. This all makes his average tier a B, which means he's an okay brawler to upgrade. For number 64, it's Nita, and she was a pretty weak brawler 3 years ago. More recently though, she's risen up the tiers with a couple of buffs and a hypercharge, which takes her to B tier on average. And right after Nita is another spawner, Jessie. 3 years ago, Jessie was pretty good at A tier, but then she got nerfed, which brought her down the meta until the pet gear got added, and then her hypercharge, and then her reworked hypercharge, and now she's doing pretty well at A tier. On average though, her usual performance was in the B tier. Blue has always been around the B tier, and it seems like he just naturally tends to slip down the meta, if not buffed, because the 2 nerfs he has only ever gotten are to his hypercharge. This all makes his average tier B. Tara gets power crept quite often, which explains her periodically going in and out of the A and B tiers. Fortunately though, her new hypercharge should be able to help out. B tier on average. 8-bit has also always been around the B tier purely because of the massive damage he can output, especially with his turret, but he is limited by his slow speed, so his average tier is B. Mandy has only been out for 2 years, but in the time she has been out, her long range has allowed her to be pretty average, making her usually sit in the B tier. Braum really struggles against aggressive brawlers, so whenever they're meta, he just drops down the tier list. He has been B tier on average though, an okay brawler to upgrade according to the data. Rose is honestly a pretty solid tank, never dipping below the C tier and sometimes even hitting the S tier. The fact that she has the ability to become invincible for a couple of seconds just by getting hit and using the tank trait is a really valuable asset, making her B tier on average. Willow has very little weaknesses for a thrower, as she can counter assassins with her super and gadget, and other throwers with her main attack. However, she can't deal burst damage due to her attack doing damage over time, putting her into B tier on average. Maisie has been quite good in the past, especially good when she could cycle her super with just 1 super hit and 2 normal attacks. But then, Supercell nerfed her supercharge rate such that she couldn't do that, and that caused her to drop right down the meta, so she was B tier on average over the past 3 years. In the past, Supercell has said that Carl is one of the hardest brawlers to balance, and it really shows in this graph. He's either at the top of the meta in S tier or falling down to the C or D tier. More recently though, he's been feeling pretty average, placing himself in the tier of B. Surge really relies on being able to get his second stage close to the start of the game, and his 4th stage being valuable, so if those things aren't true, he just drops down the meta. However, recently, Surge has been pretty good because an aggro meta has risen and he got his hypercharge, placing him in B tier on average. Tick is probably the definition of consistently B tier because he's been B tier for almost 3 years straight, so his average tier is obviously gonna be B, making him a very reliable brawler to upgrade. Buzz has been a bit more unstable than Tick, falling down to the D tier purely because of power creep, but ever since he's gotten a hypercharge, he's been a more consistent brawler, making his average tier B. Ashe has had somewhat of an interesting past in terms of the meta, having some peaks of being at S tier, but also having long periods of being at the B or C tiers, where he's staying right now due to being overshadowed by other tanks. When he gets his hypercharge though, I expect him to go back up the meta, but so far, he's been B tier on average. Janet fell off hard from S to F tier after Supercell gave her numerous nerfs. The meta right now also doesn't favor her, with tons of aggressive brawlers who she can't really take down, doing only 6,000 damage with 3 attacks. Factoring in the high of being at the S tier though, she gets an average tier of B. Nani has been a pretty good sharpshooter most of the time, helped by her insane damage potential if she hits all 3 of her projectiles, landing her in B tier on average. Ems has been very consistent at around the B tier over the past 3 years, making her a very safe option to upgrade if you want a brawler that counters tanks. 3 years ago, Brock used to be pretty bad because he was just a worse paper with some wall breaking capabilities, so Supercell buffed his attack damage from 1120 to 1300 over the course of a few updates. This was probably too much though, because he was soon at the top of the meta, being able to 2-shot some brawlers with his rocket fuel gadget. Of course, this was way too broken, causing Supercell to rework him into somewhat of a splash marksman kind of brawler. This finally made him balanced, putting him in B tier on average. Barley is 4th out of the 6 artillery brawlers we're seeing on this list, so he might be worth considering to upgrade. B tier on average. Chuck hasn't really been out for that long, but in the time that he has been out, he's hovered around the A, B, and C tiers, averaging around B tier. Just keep in mind though, that if you do choose to upgrade him, he's only really viable in Heist and Hot Zone. If you disregard the giant dip to F tier, representing the time where Supercell just killed Byron with nerfs, Byron's been a pretty good brawler, being able to support his teammates while also doing decent damage. B tier. Pearl's only been out for about a year, and she's been pretty good for that year, mostly being able to keep up with the other brawlers, and being B tier on average. However, recently, she's been declining due to more tanky brawlers coming up the meta. Sam's proven to be one of the better tanks, having high survivability and mobility with his healing star power and super, placing him in the B tier on average. Gus used to be a really good support brawler, but seems like recently he's been falling off due to the increase of aggressive brawlers, placing him in the B tier on average. He did get a pretty massive 12% buff to his attack recently though, so I do expect him to go up the meta pretty soon. Migo's average tier has been B for the short time he has been out. He does seem to be going lower and lower in the meta though, as more people learn how to time their attacks against him. Buster's probably one of the most consistently good tanks in the game, placing him in B tier on average even without his hypercharge. Vigo comes in 37th, with him sometimes going up to S tier and sometimes going down to C tier, but usually bouncing back to B tier, making him B tier on average. Leon shot up from F to S tier 3 years ago because of the addition of his lollipop drop gadget. Ever since then, he's been pretty consistent at around the B and A tiers, giving him an average tier of B. Pam's another really consistent brawler, never dipping below B tier and sometimes going up to the A and S tiers. Furthermore, she still doesn't have a hypercharge, so when she does get one, she might become A tier again. B tier on average though. Griff is another very consistent brawler, always hovering around the B tier. This is because he's really versatile and especially excels when countering tanks and breaking walls with his gadget. As a result, he's B tier on average. Poco's been all over the place over the past 3 years, due to him dealing no damage but having pretty good healing capabilities. This all places him in B tier on average. Like Poco, Meg also has an unstable chart, probably due to being reworked 1,000 times. She's been B tier on average over the past 3 years though. Lolo's also been B tier on average, being a good all-rounder. B's best days are behind her, but she's still a solid brawler to upgrade, as she'll always do a ton of damage to tanks. B tier on average. Otis is the 30th best brawler to upgrade. Looking at the chart, he has had an interesting history in terms of the meta, going from D tier to S tier with a buff that made his super do damage, then being nerfed to B tier, where he sits today, making his average tier B. Kit's only been out for less than a year, so take this with a grain of salt, but he's been doing pretty well in the recent metas, so he might be worth maxing out. This makes him our first A tier placement on average. Lily's been out for even less time than Kit, so take this with an even bigger grain of salt. But after the addition of the second ammo bar, she's proven to be a very versatile assassin, especially with her Vanish gadget, giving her an average placement of A. Fang has literally never been below the B tier, except for one meta in the past few years, so he's definitely a safe brawler to upgrade. A tier on average. Squeak has been on average A tier over the past 3 years, but that's all due to his past. As of recent, Squeak's been really struggling due to Supercell nerfing his gadget a total of 4 times. He did get a hypercharge this update though, so Squeak might go up a couple of tiers. Amber has been really consistent over the past 3 years, and I really don't see her going below the B tier even with this update's nerf to her gadget. She's a really solid brawler, and I do recommend maxing her out, as she has been A tier on average. Colette just has a fundamentally good attack and super, letting her absolutely decimate tanks, and even put up a fight to non-tank brawlers, putting her in A tier on average. Bonnie has fallen down a lot since her peak, but she does have a pretty good kit, so I do see her coming back to the higher tiers with a few buffs or hypercharge. She's been A tier on average though. Like Bonnie, Eve's also been on a decline, but her ability to walk on water is a really useful trait, so I don't see her dropping down below the C tier. A tier on average. Sprout's coming in as the 20th best brawler to upgrade for the long term, as it's just fundamentally one of the best throwers to pick, at least in draft, allowing it an average placement of A. Sandy started off as an S tier brawler 3 years ago, dropped down to C tier via a ton of nerfs, then rose back up to S tier with some buffs and a hypercharge. His super is just way too fundamentally good for him to go below the B or C tiers without significant nerfs, placing him in the A tier on average. Ruffs is often forgotten about, but he's an incredibly consistent brawler, able to support his teammates by breaking walls and buffing his teammates with a super. This all places him in A tier on average. Spike comes in 17th, with his average tier also being A because of the insane damage he does up close and the reliable chip damage he does from afar. RT has only been out for a bit over a year, so there's limited data on him, but he's probably the most consistent A tier brawler you can get, only dipping down to B tier for one meta, which obviously gives him an average tier of A. Piper's one of the best and most consistent snipers on every tier list, just because of the pure amount of damage you can do with one attack, let alone 3 for max range. Furthermore, her hypercharges does a guaranteed kill or 2, because you can simply jump in on enemies, push them back, and fire a couple of shots, and all that contributes to her average tier of A. Max's speed is always going to be valuable, whether her as a brawler is good or not, especially at the higher levels, so she's probably never going to be obsolete, placing her in the A tier on average. Jean is kind of also like Max. His super just makes him so versatile that making Jean go below B tier would require significant meta changes or nerfs. Pulling just one person in game modes like Gem Grab and Bounty could mean the difference between winning and losing, which makes him A tier on average. Draco's average tier has been A tier so far, but this is obviously going to go down as he hasn't been keeping up with the meta brawlers as of recent. Gray can use his teleporting ability for a ton of cheesy strategies, and it really shows through his high tier placements even without a hypercharge. This all places him in the A tier on this tier list. And now the infamous Larry and Lori. Nothing much to say here, they've just always been one of the best throwers, A tier on average. Although Crow's role in the meta changed from being a control brawler to a heist damage dealer, he's always been a meta brawler and A tier on average. We don't have a lot of data on Angelo because he's only been out for a couple of months, but he has proven to be a pretty solid sniper in that time, with a very fast movement speed and dealing a ton of damage with just one projectile, A tier. Stu has fallen down a bit over the past 3 years due to the rising aggressive meta, but he's still a very good pick, with him being A tier on average. Belle is the best marksman on this tier list, and 6th on this tier list overall due to her fast reload speed and decent damage. A tier on average. By now, you may have noticed that a lot of these top brawlers to upgrade all have really unique abilities, such as the ability to teleport, pull enemies, or buff teammates. Cordelius is no different, with his Shadow Realm allowing him to just pick one brawler on the enemy team to 1v1 for the entire match, making him A tier on average. Charlie may just be the most fundamentally broken brawler in Brawl Stars, with her being able to just take any brawler out of the game for 5 seconds. Unfortunately or fortunately, depending on how you look at it, Supercell has nerfed her pretty hard over the past few updates, and because of that, she may go down a tier or 2 in the future. But so far, she's the first brawler, being S tier on average. Now these next 3 brawlers are all going to be new brawlers, so take these rankings with a huge grain of salt, but number 3 is Melody, who places S tier on average due to her mobility and high damage on the high safe. And number 2 and 1 tied for first place are Barry and Clancy, because they've only been out for one tier list, and of course they're S tier because they're new brawlers. And that's the entire tier list completed. By the way, if you're actually using this video to see which brawlers to upgrade, I wouldn't recommend upgrading the new brawlers at the top of the tier list like Barry and Clancy, because they got nerfed this update and are probably going to be nerfed next update as well. Instead, I would say to upgrade brawlers who've been out for more than 2 years and are near the top of the tier list, such as Max, Jean, and Piper, as they've all shown to be solid in at least a few game modes even when the meta doesn't favor them. Besides ranking every brawler in this tier list, I've also made 3rd star power concepts for every brawler. Check out that video right here, and if you enjoyed watching this video, feel free to subscribe.